he's sort of putting a positive spin on it. She's saying it's, because he's kind of impotent. Good old gruesome image of the Vikings, as always. And something really awful is going to happen to him. Hello and welcome to Echoes of History. I'm Dr. Caitlin Ellis and I'm Associate Professor of Nordic Medieval History at the University of Oslo. So I'm an expert in medieval Scandinavia, Britain, Ireland, the North Atlantic, Vikings and their whole world. In particular, we're looking at the depiction of the fearsome Viking Ivar the Boneless and a few other characters as well during the Scandinavian attacks on England in the 870s in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. I must admit, I haven't played the game before, so I'm really excited to see how they've kind of adapted history into the kind of video game world. But we should add a little content warning that there is some quite grisly Viking violence right at the very end, so just be aware of that. Good old gruesome image of the Vikings, as always.
Who stands before Ivar Ragnarsson?
Yeah, so here we have Ivar the Boneless, so actually the son of Ragnar Lothbrok. So Ragnar, or there's someone called Ragnar, or a few people called Ragnar, or sort of Reginharius in our different sources, knocking about and besieging Paris and things like that on the continent. And then we do have Ivar or Ingvar being referred to in Old English and Irish sources, which are contemporary. But the Boneless nickname seems to come a lot later. We not quite sure what it refers to, but I think we might come back to that later actually. He's got lots of tattoos here. We do have the Arabic account of Ibn Fadlan, who is journeying along the Volga and talking to the Rus in around 920. And he describes them, it's not quite clear from the Arabic if it's kind of tattooed, like if it's permanent, or if it's more kind of like painted, so it could kind of wash off. But so there is some evidence for them having kind of designs on their body. Also maybe for men and women wearing eye makeup is mentioned by a different Arabic writer. His hairstyle is quite unusual. I guess we often think of Vikings just having quite long hair. There are some sources that maybe talk about them being, maybe more the Normans as well, like in the Bayeux Tapestry, kind of being shaved on one side, and then kind of having longer hair over their eyes. But I think that's a bit more of a front versus the back thing, rather than one side being long and the other being shaved. The fearsome reputation of Ivar is something that we get kind of building up later. So he's credited with having murdered a king of East Anglia, one of the English kings, Edmund. He's killed a bit horribly, like shot with lots and lots of arrows. And because he becomes a saint, then we get lots of later sources, obviously, that talk about, how kind of nobly he suffers for Christianity, and then how awful his kind of pagan attackers and sort of torturers are.
And now we shake hands and make deals.
A nice big Viking hall there, people gathering and exchanging news, maybe socialising or feasting later. And I think here in a minute we get a mention of Halfdan the Black, this sort of king of a sort of petty king of a small part of Norway. One of our sources says that he rules a kind of kingdom in the mountains, and he's the father of Harald Fairhair here, who we'll come back to.
Many of you knew my father, Halfdan the Black, a great man who achieved great things.
They buried Halfdan's leg near our temple. The crops have never grown tall.
They buried his arse near ours, and we get nothing but a muddy river.
They're referring back to a story that we have in the sagas of Halfdan's body being kind of divided into like at least 4 parts and buried in different places, that, everyone wants a piece of the king to sort of somehow bring sort of prosperity, kind of good crops, something like that. So it's not really something that we hear about happening very often. But yeah, that's kind of the background for Harald, maybe also kind of implying that his father kind of had influence over kind of a wider area. So the original version of the story just has him being buried in the one place, where the later versions say that his head is in Ringerike. In the saga is Harald Fairhair, or Harald Fairhair, Hårfagre in Old Norse. He obviously here he does have very nice hair, although it probably means a bit more kind of beautiful hair rather than necessarily kind of referring to the colour. But here he's very kind of ambitious, that he wants to expand his rule, and that is kind of how he's presented in our later saga sources as kind of maybe being the first real king of all Norway.
I am not your enemy, King Harald, but I will not be your subject. Tomorrow we sail for greener shores, and so my kingdom is yours.
This saddens me, noble Hjor. And does your wife agree? Is she not tired of limping ever westward?
My husband and I are as one in this, Lord. We do not limp together, we fly.
I'm sad to lose a woman of your spirit, Ljuvina. But I hold no grudge. May the fates grant you good luck.
But obviously that's going to create some enemies or people who aren't so happy with that. So we had the couple there who decide they're going to leave. We get that a lot in the Icelandic sagas as well, actually, that they decide they don't want to kind of live under his rule. And, you know, I guess the Icelanders then like to portray themselves as being quite kind of independently minded and sort of freedom loving. So that's sort of seen as then one reason why people go west, why the Vikings kind of go raiding and traveling out into the North Atlantic to kind of escape from Harald, which is quite interesting.
You are Kjotve's slayer. This man has slandered your clan.
Maybe kind of an assembly, like a thing, as it's called in Old Norse, when you kind of have all the kind of leading people kind of gathered together. Although then we wouldn't necessarily have women there, unfortunately. Usually just kind of men who of a certain status, who kind of own enough to be kind of represented at an assembly. Or maybe this is a bit more of just a kind of political meeting. It's sort of difficult to tell. But yeah, I guess this is a period where you maybe had lots of smaller kings of petty kingdoms, and over time these kind of coalesce into a larger kingdom, which I guess we can see in a lot of the rest of medieval Europe as well.
Is proof that we will not lay down without a fight.
But yeah, Harald as a historical figure is kind of hard to grasp. So he's very, very big in all of these sagas, but the nickname also seems to kind of come along later. But yeah, in terms of contemporary sources, we don't have so much. We do have a skaldic poem, an Old Norse poem kind of about him and his victories. So there's probably someone called Harald, but it's difficult, I suppose, to know how much influence he really had at the time, or whether kind of later kings who want to kind of trace their lineage back to him kind of like to emphasize his role. You know, I guess everyone wants to have a kind of founding father figure, as it were.
Word! And I will not yield a title that should be mine by right!
Then war will continue. Men will die, villages will burn, you foolish boy. This is our only way towards true peace.
You will die a thrall. You drink addled cow. Alone and toothless in a bed of straw.
Forgive my son. He is ruled by his emotions.
I take no offense, Styrbjörn Jarl, and I thank you for your fealty. It is natural to fear change, to resist it. But all things change and all things end. The lessons of Ragnarok are clear.
In reference to Ragnarok, so sort of our Old Norse mythological references, the idea of kind of the end of the world, which some people think made kind of Vikings feel a bit fatalistic, you know, that if you kind of know the whole world's going to end, maybe you're more likely to kind of take risks and don't mind dying gloriously in battle or something like that.
Do you dream of a glorious future, Ivar? A warrior like you would be a boon to my clan.
My fate is tied to my brothers.
Yeah, so as I say, a lot of the sagas kind of have people having to decide if they are happy to stay and kind of be a follower of Harold, be loyal to him, or kind of, go and seek their fortune elsewhere, because maybe it's then too risky to stay if you're not kind of fully on board with his kind of expansionist plan.
Brother must serve under me. Take tomorrow to think on this. But let us leave these matters for another time. Tonight we will eat and drink like gods and wake in a kingdom made new.
Haggling over silver is a bad look for the son of Ragnar Lothbrok.
So here we're still having the reference to the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, but we have Ubbe as well as Ivar, or Ivar. So we do see both of them acting together in our sources. I guess Ubbe has a bit more of a role in the Vikings TV show and other places, but we don't really know quite as much about him.
Our dear Thane Ceolwulf here. It's not a role I begged for, but it's what Mercia needs just now.
And here, this Ceolwulf being kind of set up as this kind of Viking puppet, as it were, to rule Mercia. That's also something that we can see where they've got that from in the sources, from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Asser's Life of Alfred. So Alfred the Great, who I guess is, famous for being the sole defender against the Vikings, the kind of last remaining, or the last kingdom, as the last remaining defender against the Vikings on the English side. So it may well be that because the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as well is also from a West Saxon perspective, they might be kind of trying to downplay this Ceolwulf a bit and kind of cast him in a kind of bad light. So in 2015, there was a coin hoard found, which ends up being really exciting and kind of changing a bit how we kind of perceived this period of time, because it's known as the Two Emperors coinage, and some was minted in the name of Alfred and some in the name of Ceolwulf. So it seems like they were really actually acting together a lot, and maybe kind of allied, that they're using this kind of Roman imagery of these two emperors kind of side by side on the coin. So that's kind of quite a different idea than what we get kind of retrospectively in the sources, that, it's all about Alfred, and Alfred is the saviour, and Ceolwulf is just kind of, doesn't even really have a good claim to be king or anything. They're describing him as a Thane. But his name would be kind of consistent with royal names in Mercia at the time. So there's no particular reason to think that he didn't really have a good claim. But since Alfred will kind of subsume Mercia into his own kingdom to kind of expand England, then, it's in his interest to take all the credit for himself, basically.
You never said this one was a poet.
I need to piss.
Eivor, is your axe sharpened?
I'm ready for the spear din.
And the thunder of shields, yes.
Yeah, so spear din and thunder of shields, these sort of phrases are things we get quite a lot in the Norse poetry. We call them kennings. They're kind of these circumlocutions, kind of roundabout ways of saying something. It's a more poetic way of referring to a battle, to say something like spear din or thunder of shields, rather than... And obviously the poetry has to talk about battle quite a lot, so they maybe need to find some more interesting ways to keep referring to battle and fighting and things like that.
The fight is nowhere to be found in this boy.
A boy who happens to be Ceolwulf's son.
It's sort of an interesting issue, I guess, that probably was something that medieval leaders had to face quite a lot, with this issue of your son or, your heir. You probably want them to get some military experience because you want all of your warriors, you want the army to kind of be able to trust them. If something happens to you, you want there to be kind of a smooth succession, that they'll be prepared to follow this person. But then your heir is also quite valuable, so maybe you don't quite want to put them in harm's way too much. So I think this is something that kind of rings true in a sense. Ceolbert himself is kind of a creation for the game. I guess the name can kind of see they've followed the logic of these kind of naming conventions within the royal dynasty, of kind of using that first element again from his father's name, from Ceolwulf, and Bert as an ending we get quite a lot.
Look at these pagan rats. Ravenous, unseemly beasts teeming over holy ground.
Have a care, Lord. These pagan rats outnumber us.
I can see that, fool.
Pagan rats is a good striking phrase, but a lot of the sources from Britain and the continent at the time, that is one of the things they pick up on quite a lot when they're referring to the Vikings, particularly at the beginning, when they first encounter them. They'll often just say pagan, heathen, something kind of foreigner in the Irish sources, something a bit dismissive. And I guess they've chosen to give these English characters kind of the modern English accents from the region. You know, we have Burgred having a kind of West Midlands kind of Black Country accent, and then the Northern accent for the Northumbrian guy. And we do have different dialects within Old English, so linguists can kind of tell that there was variation within the language. So in a sense, that's fair. It maybe didn't sound exactly like the modern accents do today, but can understand why they've done that. Yeah, eagles. And yeah, I guess this is quite a grand, you know, this big stone keep sort of looks a bit more like what we might expect in a slightly later period, you know, in the Norman period, maybe with big kind of stone castles and so on. Tamworth, we have a few more references to a bit later on as well, in the 900s of Æthelflad, the daughter of Alfred, you know, when they kind of subsumed Mercia. She dies there, I think, as well, but she's mentioned a few times connected to Tamworth.
If you want my crown, Uber Ragnarsson, you must pry it from the hands of my bloodless corpse. Man the walls!
Take 3 men and search the rear.
The Great Army has now taken Tamworth, which isn't something that we have a record of in the sources as happening. Obviously, they do take a lot of other places, so fairly successful. And I guess we're getting a bit more of an insight into Ivar's character. So Adam of Bremen says he's kind of one of the cruelest Viking there ever was. So he does sort of have this very kind of fearsome reputation, and I guess that's something they kind of lean into here in the game. Also the Vikings TV show too, it's, you know, that very kind of sadistic portrayal that even the other Vikings are a bit kind of taken aback maybe by the way that he acts. And yeah, being associated with martyring this English king. We have this slightly later account by Abba of Fleury, which really kind of plays into that aspect.
Meet us at Tonner's camp when you're finished here. And bring your patience.
And your axe! Where is your king, Saxon? Where is he?
Lord our Father, grant me salvation.
Here, I guess we have a bit more of the tension between paganism and Christianity. You know, him, the prisoner there, kind of praying to our Lord. Not that it really does him any good. So yeah, we do have some times where we can see maybe a bit more coexistence between the two religions. There's a really famous, like a soapstone mold from Denmark, where it has the shapes to make, you know, amulets out of metal, and there's a cross, a Christian cross, kind of crucifix, and there's also a Thor's hammer in the same mold. So the same craftsman is obviously making pendants for both pagans and Christians, and presumably that's not a problem. Maybe it does lead to some disagreements, but maybe often it's a bit more kind of pragmatic and, you know, based on power and money and the usual things. Okay, so they've managed to capture Burgred. His crown is kind of interesting. We're not even quite sure they wore crowns at a really early stage.
Burgred. All that remains is a coronation. It
does look a bit like some of the famous treasure from Sutton Hoo and places like that. But usually it's garnet, usually it'd be red, the stone kind of inlaid in the metal with a bit of foil behind it, so it really kind of catches the light and glitters.
No, I'm fine.
Here we have his wife, and we don't always know so much about women in the medieval period. They're not always leaving as much of a trace in our sources as we might like. But we do know a tiny bit about Æthelswith, about Burgred's wife. So she is the daughter of Alfred of Wessex. So Mercia and Wessex have often kind of been at war and kind of jostling for who's the most powerful, but they do try and kind of ally and create some peace. And Æthelswith does witness a charter, a kind of grant of land. So that's somewhat unusual for a queen at this point to sort of be a bit more active in the court in that sense, and be witnessing kind of things that are going on.
Called me boneless because I move like a reed in the wind.
Not because you're always too drunk to plough.
Now we get the whole Boneless discussion about what does his nickname, what does this epithet kind of mean? And I must admit, historians usually try to avoid talking about this, I think, because we don't know the answer, so we're not so sure. So yeah, here he's saying, or he just sort of moves like a reed in the wind. He's sort of putting a positive spin on it. She's saying it's because he's kind of impotent. So that is one of the suggestions that has been put forward. Other people think, maybe it means this kind of spineless, kind of cowardly thing. So it could be more kind of a bit more metaphorical, a bit more kind of figurative. Other people think, maybe it means that he had some kind of disability or kind of injury. And I guess that's the way they take it in the Vikings TV show as well. That he struggles to walk. He's maybe got 2 ravens on the back of her shield, maybe like Odin's raven. He famously has the 2 ravens that sit on his shoulder, Hugin and Munin, kind of fought and memory, who report back and bring information to him. But we get the raven quite a lot in these in imagery.
Because he is my brother, I love him. And I will do what it takes to drag him back around to my way of thinking.
And this discussion between sort of him versus Ubba, kind of their different attitudes, is also quite interesting, because I suppose we kind of start to see, after the initial Viking raiding and all the kind of battles and kind of violence, some of them obviously do decide to settle down. There used to be an argument there wasn't enough land in Scandinavia, so they just need to go and get some more. If you've not inherited at home, or you've only got a small plot, you want to go and kind of seek your fortune abroad. We're having Ceolwulf sat on the throne, so the sort of transition of power of getting Burgred to kind of give up his crown to no longer be king of Mercia. We could maybe see this sort of meeting here in the hall as a form of the Witan. So that literally just means wise men, but we see it as kind of a king's council, of all the kind of the leading noblemen. He's not looking very happy, is he? That's fair enough, after being captured. So all of these kind of leading kind of noblemen. So when the king is ruling, he probably would maybe want to kind of consult them. You want to keep them on side, ideally. Maybe you do think they've got something to offer in terms of good advice and so on. But they may be particularly important in these kind of transitions of power to kind of confirm succession, which obviously sometimes they hope would be smoother than this, that you might get to hand it over to a son or a close relative or something like that. This is obviously a more unusual situation that we have presented here.
The Thane Ceolwulf.
Mercia has spoken, Lord. The crown.
We do know that Burgred lives. He's not kind of killed off. So he does end up kind of going off to Rome with his wife. That is something that quite a lot of kings do in the medieval period. Sometimes they do it during their reign, just as like a pilgrimage, just to show that they're good Christian kings. It gets you some brownie points to get into heaven and all of that. And maybe you kind of might meet some other kind of rulers and kings in the rest of Europe. So it could be kind of networking in a sense. But it maybe is also a kind of a decent retirement option. We sometimes get people retiring to kind of monasteries, even within kind of their kingdom as well, maybe as a way of sort of trying to kind of remove yourself from the line of fire, say, okay, I'm not involved in the kind of political things anymore, but hoping you won't be killed off, to say, I kind of willingly give it up.
Worry not, Dane. I shall resign this crown and this pagan-infested kingdom.
Saying he resigns, but obviously he's particularly showing his displeasure at the kind of the Danish angle, or the sort of pagan infestation, I think it was that he said. So I suppose, as I mentioned earlier, we are getting some Norse people kind of settling, just being farmers and things like that. And it's difficult always to know how that went down with the locals. They were trading with each other. We have these big Viking camps at Repton and Torksey, where we have lots of archaeological evidence from all sorts of trade and kind of craft work, things that were going on. So they must have kind of relied a bit on the wider population, the surrounding area.
I'll go anywhere. Here, I resign it. Here.
Take this lord and his wife to Rome. He is hereby exiled, never to return.
Actually, we do have a brief reference from earlier of Burgred being in contact with the Pope in Rome, and actually the Pope then says that the Viking invasions is a punishment for the sins of Burgred's people, of the Mercians. That's also quite a common thing that we see being said, that, you know, it's the English's own fault, you know, they should have acted better, and then they might not have been attacked by Vikings.
Not half bad, boy. But be fierce, dirty, strike at my balls.
Ivar, are you training the boy or tormenting him?
One will lead to the other in time.
Eivor.
So here, I guess we have the kind of, this scene is kind of about the meeting of all of these different groups, the kind of negotiations, and obviously for the ease of us as viewers, they're obviously all speaking in modern English. Obviously that wouldn't have been the case at the time. We do think that Old Norse and Old English at this time, so, you know, the language being spoken by the people in England and the language being spoken by the Scandinavians, would have been like a lot closer than it is now, and, you know, kind of mutually intelligible maybe. So maybe just with a little bit of effort or a bit of concentration, you probably could communicate, at least on a kind of basic level. So, you know, I guess we have some examples of that today. If we think about people speaking modern Norwegian, Danish, Swedish, you know, they can understand each other even if, you know, there's differences. They're kind of able to communicate. So that may well have helped a lot of the kind of communication between Vikings and the English at the time. Latin, I guess, is kind of a common sort of lingua franca in a sense. It was the language of the church. So sometimes different kind of groups, different peoples and linguistic groups might have used Latin as a sort of way to communicate with each other. But it's a bit more complicated when we get to the Celtic languages. They're sort of a different branch of the kind of family tree of European languages. So when we have the Welsh characters, you know, speaking some older version of modern Welsh, so Brittonic languages, they wouldn't have been able to just understand each other or kind of get by like the English and the Norse. So they would have had to have an interpreter maybe. We don't hear so much about interpreters in the sources, but we kind of assume they must be there. Very occasionally there's a little reference. Or maybe there were a lot of people who were bilingual, who spoke, you know, more than one language. That would have probably been a very useful skill.
Explain to the good bishop our position.
Yes, my sovereign. Bishop Deorlav. We are deaf to offers of peace until Guriad is returned to us.
The king's brother king's brother is a mouldering sack of cow dung.
You. I know your face, your stench. Ivar.
And I guess, yeah, we have the bishop here who's kind of helping the negotiations. So maybe he might be someone who's kind of multilingual, say, or we're using Latin. And that is something that we do see a bit in the medieval period, that kind of a churchman, a bishop, you know, will kind of help in negotiations, you know, supposed to be somewhat impartial maybe between these sort of groups who are fighting, and, you know, maybe just kind of lend that kind of religious air to things, that, you know, you should agree to these terms, and if you don't, you know, if you agree to them and you go back on it, you're kind of sinning perhaps. So it can maybe be useful to have a bishop involved. And then this Rhodri Mawr, Rhodri the Great. I think he's maybe the only Welsh, or the earliest Welsh king to be given that kind of title, that kind of nickname. So he was quite an important figure in medieval Welsh history, and his whole kind of family as well. Although the character of his brother here, Guriad, seems to, I think, be a kind of another kind of creation for the game. Although they've probably got his name from, I think he has his father and maybe a son who's called that. So they've kind of taken the name from you know, some kind of likely suspects.
This is a house of God. Let us take some few minutes to gather ourselves, shall we? Eivor, to me, I do not know you well, but Ceolbert believes you a steady head.
So we have her being the main character, I guess, being portrayed as slightly more kind of level-headed than all the kind of fiery Ivar, who's, you know, very impulsive, I suppose, and not necessarily very strategic or kind of And this whole thing about there kind of being this history between Rhodri and Ivar, that also is a kind of something that they've imagined up for the game. We do know that Rhodri had fought some Vikings, so he had fought more death. He had fought what the sources call the Dark Foreigners, so just one group of Vikings, because they called them foreigners quite a lot. But yeah, obviously also the English and the Welsh can often be in conflict with each other. Taking hostages could be something that could be quite useful for a sort of strategic point of view to try and get people to come to terms. But yeah, obviously quite risky if you're a hostage, that it can all go horribly wrong.
It is just an empty voice between axe blows.
We had our negotiations kind of breaking down quite dramatically in the last scene, and then here I guess we're still having a bit more negotiation, people hoping to avoid further conflicts and warfare.
And but pray and give thanks for this moment of rest.
The Britons have come!
The moment has ended.
This way, by the great oak!
Yeah, I get that. So that in the game they kind of refer to them as Britons rather than Welsh, which yeah kind of makes sense. So we all sort of in the sources then we get kind of Britons being divided slightly between kind of those who are in what would now be Cornwall and what's now Wales, and then kind of north of that in Strathclyde as well. But yeah, it's quite interesting that they've got the Queen negotiating here, Angharad, which I think means beloved in Welsh, Angharad Fairhair. And so since you can obviously play as a female character, we're kind of getting a bit more about the role of women here, which is interesting. It's something that sort of, I think I always feel like my students really want there to be lots of like kick-ass women in the medieval period, and we quite like the idea of it. And there obviously were some women who were able to kind of wield power in some senses and kind of have some influence, maybe more kind of like soft power. You know, these are still kind of fundamentally patriarchal societies, so it's sort of difficult not to get too carried away, maybe a little bit of wishful thinking sometimes. But at the same time, they still did have some rights in Scandinavia and in Britain and Ireland as well. And yeah, you know, presumably the queens are kind of able to kind of influence people in the court and maybe their families. They might be used to kind of forge an alliance. In Old English, Beowulf, things we talk about kind of peace weavers. But yeah, we do get quite a lot of striking characters in Norse mythology as well. But yeah, difficult to know how much that kind of reflects reality.
Ceolwulf must learn the good news. Will you tell him when you see him?
I'll find him now.
Okay, so now we have Ivar having captured Rhodri after fighting in his really ridiculously large castle, and something really awful is going to happen to him.
Now comes the dragon to feed on his favorite meal, the blood eagle.
So this blood eagle thing is something quite famous or infamous, and much sort of discussed in amongst kind of Viking scholars today about, do we think this is kind of a later exaggeration about kind of Viking brutality, or is it something that they genuinely did? The most well-known time that we hear about a blood eagle is actually also still to do with Ivar and his brothers, or the sons of Ragnar. They're supposed to have performed it on King Alla of Northumbria as revenge for the fact that he had killed Ragnar. He had killed their father and put him in like a snake pit. And that's then kind of used as one of the reasons why they might invade England in the first place, to kind of avenge him. But yeah, it's really grisly and unpleasant. So they're kind of separating the ribs from the spine, and either kind of the ribs being opened out or the lungs being kind of taken out from the body and kind of arranged to look like the wings of an eagle. So that's kind of where it gets its name. But some people think that they've just kind of we've kind of completely misunderstood some verse and poetry from the time in Old Norse. So this kind of use of kind of kennings and kind of roundabout poetic language, that it says something about kind of carving an eagle on the back of someone. So it's a little bit more elusive, a bit more kind of ambiguous than what we have here. And often we get kind of references to eagles and ravens, kind of birds of prey, in the poetry because, you know, as kind of carrying creatures. So someone might be described as being, the way to call someone a good warrior might be to say that he like feeds the raven, or he feeds the wolf, you know, that he leaves a lot of bodies lying around on the battlefield, and then all of these animals will come and maybe kind of feed on the bodies, kind of as carrion feeders. So yeah, it's still not really settled as to whether this actually happened. If it did, it probably was only for kind of special occasions, not sort of a very common thing that happened.
Poor Ceolwulf. He barely said a word.
When?
I pushed that dragon dagger into his heart.
No.
Just a soft little squeal.
As I kind of mentioned before, Ivar, we do have at least a version of him in our kind of contemporary sources. He's sort of moving around a lot with the Great Army in England, and actually a lot in Ireland as well. He seems to be very active there. We have a whole kind of dynasty that seems to be descended from him, so called the Ivar, the kind of descendants of Ivar, in the same way that we have the Enail or the Ivrian descendants of Niall and Brian, you know, things like that. So he does kind of have a quite like impressive legacy all over kind of Britain and Ireland in this period. But one source says that he's killed in Ireland, not in kind of Wales as we have here. And other sources kind of say that he was buried somewhere in England, kind of near the sea, which I guess is kind of nice and poetic. And then there's even a story kind of linking that later on to 1066. And sort of another attempted invasion by kind of Scandinavians and other things. Kind of poetry to Canute the Great in the Danish invasion also kind of refers back to Ivar, so sort of seeing him as a maybe kind of successful example of conquering England. But yeah, here he's obviously very sadistic. Thanks for joining me as I look at Assassin's Creed Valhalla and its depiction of Ivar the Boneless and many others. You can go deeper into the history that inspires the Assassin's Creed games by watching weekly interviews with historical experts, all on the Echoes of History channel.